This is World History of Christianity, Chapter 6, Part 3. We are on page 221. The Rise of Independent Churches. Colonialism had an ambiguous role in its impact on Christianity. On the one hand, it tended to make the church more dependent than before on foreign missionaries. They were the ones expected to make decisions, liaise with governments, provide the technical expertise. In pre-colonial times, missionaries had been on intimate terms with the local community, living alongside people, often sharing a similar standard of material culture with a fluent and often idiomatic command of the language. Now there was a withdrawal upwards into institutional fortresses, hospitals and colleges and mission compounds. Moreover, the colonial mentality tended to force a certain social distance between expatriate and native, what has been called veranda Christianity. On the other hand, colonialism did vastly expand the scope of missionary activity into every part of the land. Much of this work, in fact an increasing amount, was done by African catechists, evangelists, and teachers. For many, the sight of a missionary was a rare and special occasion. For the vast majority of communities, it is the African catechist, either from a neighboring ethnic group or a child of the soil who had received the new faith while working outside the home area, who is remembered as the one who established the church in that area. The vernacular and local character of Christianity really became established in the colonial era, often for the first time. To what extent was Christianity concerned with the modern? It encouraged a reliance on the hospital and Western medicine, and that had implications for the whole understanding of the nature of sickness and health and its relation to the spirit world. It insisted on literacy and a long catechumenate. But was there another way of being a Christian? It is interesting that the first breakaway from mission Christianity in Uganda in 1914, the Bamalaki, concentrated on these two issues. It was as wrong, said the founder, Yoswa Kate Mujima, to rely on mission medicine as it was to consult traditional diviners and mediums. It was equally wrong to insist on literacy. The Bamalaki offered instant baptism and the prestige of a new, biblical or European name. As a consequence, it was nicknamed Dinila Rahishi, religion on the cheap. The period just before and after the First World War was a significant time for the birth of African Christian independency in many parts of the continent. In 1913, William Wade Harris, from the Grebo people of Liberia, having had a vision of the Archangel Gabriel in prison, began a dynamic evangelistic campaign along the coast of West Africa, preaching largely in Pidgin English, the message of the power of Christ over the spirits. He wore a white gown and black bands and carried a gourd, a cross, a Bible, and a bowl for baptizing. He baptized thousands without the normal restrictions demanded by missionary Christianity and permanently rewrote the religious geography of the Ivory Coast. Some years before this, in South Africa, a Zulu prophet by the name Isaiah Shembe established his Nazareth at Ikufakameni in the Drakensberg Mountains, just one of a plethora of groups which collectively have become known as Zionism. Stressing prayer and divine healing, gathering at a sacred place, their Nazareth or Jordan or Zion, and expressing an exuberant combination of biblical and African symbols and motifs. Another outstanding prophet of this period is Simon Kimbengu, from the Lower Congo, home of Congo Catholicism and the first independent Christian prophet, Donna Beatrice. Kimbengu was brought up in the Baptist church and was baptized. In 1921, he began a remarkable healing ministry in his home village of Nkamba, attracting crowds of expectant people. The Belgian authorities took fright at the potential disorder and subversive nature of this popular movement, and Kimbengu was sentenced to death, commuted to life imprisonment. And Kimbengu did spend the next 30 years of his life, indeed the rest of his life, in prison. It was only in the last days of colonial rule in the 1950s and early 1960s that a cohesive denomination, L'Église sur la Terre par Simon Kimbengu, was able to emerge, along with other groups more or less orthodox in Christian terms, which claimed Kimbengu's inspiration. The Kimbenguists were to become the largest single independent church in Africa. Harris, Shembe, Kimbengu were early and particularly dynamic and interesting examples of a movement of independency which became widespread in many parts of Africa. In Nigeria, this phenomenon is known as Aladura, the praying churches. The Cherubim and Seraphim, co-founded by a woman, Christiana Captain Obiodun, is a particularly famous example, partly because of its strength in the post-war period among the Nigerian diaspora in Europe. There are many other examples of women founders and leaders of independent churches, reflecting the important role women have traditionally played in the spiritual realm. Gaudensia Oko of the Maria Legio Church of Western Kenya, the largest independent church to come directly out of the Roman Catholic Church, or Alice Lenshina's Lumpa Church in Zambia. Independent churches are often contrasted to the mission-founded churches by their wearing of flowing white garments and headgear, their use of drums and responsive chanting, and their emphasis on spiritual healing. They are interested in locating the cause of sickness in the realm of evil spirits, charms, and witchcraft, and in confronting and defeating those powers in the name of Christ. They may be tolerant of polygamy and customs relating to birth, marriage, and death, which had been condemned as pagan by mission churches. Often condemned or despised by Christians of mission-founded churches for syncretism or a superficial understanding of the gospel, the members of these churches may well reply with a good deal of cogency that they are much more successful at integrating the gospel into the African mode of being and overcoming the painful dichotomy lived by many mission adherents who worship the Christian God on a Sunday and consult the traditional medium or diviner from Monday to Saturday. But it would be wrong to think too much of rigid contrasts between two conflicting traditions. Both are, in fact, very diverse, and African instituted churches demonstrate a whole spectrum of judgments about the relation to African tradition or the place of Orthodox doctrine. Nor should one forget the links which the independent movement has often had, especially in Southern Africa, with American Adventist or Apostolic Pentecostal groups, not to mention the role of the Jehovah's Witnesses in the movement known as Watchtower, founded by the Malawian Eliot Kamwana, also in 1914, which has had a wide influence in Zambia and Malawi. Independency is a complex and diverse phenomenon. Other movements of spiritual renewal. One of the reasons for not being too quick to characterize the mission churches as foreign and independent churches as African, the mission churches as Orthodox and the African churches as syncretistic, is that such a division seriously underestimates the common search of all African Christians for ways of living both an authentically Christian and an authentically African life. This has often been best expressed in what Hastings has called associational religion, characterized by its lay rather than clerical involvement, its African rather than missionary leadership, and the larger degree of women's participation than was often accepted in the official aspects of the church life. In fact, one important example of the associated pattern, the Manano, South Africa, or Ruadzano, Rhodesia, was specifically for women, a prayer union or fellowship, a society of mutual help and spiritual uplifting for women. The most famous movement of renewal is probably the Balakole revival movement within the Protestant churches of East Africa. Balokole is Luganda for the saved people. This movement sprang from a remarkable partnership between a CMS medical missionary, Dr. Joe Church, and Simeone Nsibambi from a distinguished family in Buganda. Members called themselves Ab Oluganda. In English, the term brethren is often used, though it should be noted that Ab Oluganda in Luganda refers to both men and women. The revival came to have a decisive influence on the character of many mission-founded churches. At one level, it is a typically evangelical movement, with a strong emphasis on the need for repentance of sin and on sole reliance on the atoning work of Christ's blood on the cross. The revival did not fear to be confrontational, fearlessly speaking out, walking in the light, against a complacent compromise with sin and robustly intolerant of all attempts to incorporate traditional religious pagan practices into the church. Brethren were also fearless in regarding white people as equals, equally in need of repentance and salvation, a quite radical egalitarianism in a racially stratified colonial society. At another level, the movement was profoundly African, seeing itself as a new clan, stressing the intense solidarity of the group, arranging marriages, looking after widows. Beginning within the Anglican Church of Uganda and Rwanda, the movement spread to the Mennonite and Lutheran churches of Tanzania, and the Presbyterian and Methodist churches of Kenya, where the Balakole became famous for their refusal at personal risk to participate in the oathing ceremonies of Mau Mau, the blood of Jesus, not of goats, being the only acceptable oathing permitted of a Christian. In Catholicism, the lay apostolate has been encouraged, for example, through participation in the Legion of Mary or devotion to the Uganda martyrs, but clerical direction can often be an inhibiting factor. The Jama family movement in the Shaba and Kasai Catholicism of Zaire is a notable example of a predominantly lay spirituality, which went a long way to overcome a top-down clerically directed approach. Yet Jama has clerical origins. It springs out of the attempt of a priest, the Flemish Franciscan missionary Placide Tempels, to express an effective Franciscan type of spirituality based on God's love. This could be experienced through people being drawn into the love of Christ and of his mother Mary, which in turn elicits a love for each other, for the Father, and for the family of the church. Jama involved invitation of man and wife, Baba and Mama, into a spiritual encounter with each other and with God, mediated by the priest. Like the Balakole, Jama saw itself as a movement within the church, but one can see the scope for overtly sensual interpretations, which the Catholic Church found difficult to contain. Even the formidably puritanical Balakole had to deal with these problems in its early days. Women have often played a leading role in the life of the church. They certainly have for many years been the majority in most congregations. Often their contribution has been overlooked or taken for granted by a largely male leadership. In turn, their historical contribution does not get recorded. They tend to fall through the cracks of academic analysis. Elizabeth Isici. The case of Moderlina Magdalene Vehechtikui provides a vivid early example of this. When George Schmidt left the Moravian mission at Genadendal in South Africa in 1742, he left 3 baptized members of the Christian community, 2 men and Lena. He commissioned the men to continue the work, but they soon dropped off. Only Lena persevered in the faith, steadfastly teaching others the Bible and Christian prayer for 50 years, until in 1792 a new group of Moravians arrived. Surprisingly, the new missionaries were not sure of the validity of her faith. Perhaps her articulation of it did not quite conform to their understanding of heartfelt evangelical religion. She died in 1800, only 5 days before the new church was consecrated. In the 19th century, missionary service increasingly offered single European women a chance for active ministry, denied them in the churches at home. The faith missions pioneered the use of single women, but by the last decades of the century, all Protestant mission societies were following the practice. One of the great heroines of the missionary endeavor was Mary Slessor of Calabar, second only to David Livingstone in esteem in her native Scotland. Slessor was a woman of great energy and initiative who found a personal fulfillment she might have found difficult to achieve in Dundee. For African women, the benefits of Christianity might be more ambiguous. Certainly the missions had a strong rhetoric about raising womanhood, but at times it served to place boundaries on what women could do. As church institutions became more structured, the ordained ministry and even the work of catechists and evangelists seemed to be confined increasingly to men. Catholic religious orders certainly did provide a clearly defined religious role for women. In Uganda, as in other places where Catholicism has been widely successful, local orders have been successfully established. For example, the Bana Bikira, Daughters of the Virgin, and the Little Sisters of St. Francis. Both Protestant and Catholic missions have offered secondary education and domestic science finishing schools for women. Often at first they were particularly directed towards providing suitable Christian wives. By the mid-20th century, they were beginning to stress the independent role of women as professional people in many fields. But it was only in the 1980s that there was much movement in opening up the ordained ministry to women. However, long before that, the Mañano and Mothers Union were providing women with a powerful forum for influencing the life of the church. In stressing the importance of Christian marriage, these types of organizations have sometimes created something of a gulf between women married in church, the ring wife, and those who, for one reason or another, for society generally militates against straightforwardly Christian forms of marriage, find themselves in relationships which are not blessed by the church. Throughout Africa, women tend to be the backbone of the rural churches. Government policy in South Africa often forced women to stay in the homelands while their menfolk increasingly were drawn to the towns. But even in South African towns, women tend to be the mainstay of church life. Iris Berger has suggested that, in the particular conditions of apartheid, women in towns were unable to sustain the patriarchal kinship relations in the rural areas which remained of crucial importance to males. The church provided an alternative community, a supportive network, and an important way of making sense of urban reality. We pray and cry and think that all our problems will be solved. In church, you find 200 women and 10 men. Lucy Mubello. I think that was the only loving time I had with my children, just holding their hands and walking with them to church. Even today, I love to go to church, only now my company is my grandchildren instead of my children. Emma Mashanini. Berger also notes that the churches, both mission-founded and Zionist, provide women with religious sanction for their efforts to redirect male resources and responsibility from antisocial activities such as drinking in shebeens to more constructive occupations conducive to family life and well-being. Decolonization. Decolonialization. Even in the period of a high colonialism, there were individual missionaries who were prepared to be extremely critical of colonial policy, especially in areas where the interests of African populations seemed to be subordinated to those of a white settler community demanding economic privilege and political rights for itself. In the interwar period, Archdeacon Owen in Kenya and Arthur Shirley Cripps in southern Rhodesia were vigorous campaigners against injustices and spokesmen for African grievances. Moreover, there was increasingly a body of educated, articulate African Christians, especially from Protestant churches, who could directly voice such concerns. In his evocatively titled book, Are We Not Also Men?, Terence Ranger has provided a vivid portrait of the Samkanji family of southern Rhodesia. Thompson Samkanj was a Methodist minister and a key figure in the development of a nascent modern nationalist consciousness. His wife, Grace, was an important role model economically and socially for African Christian women. Their two sons, Stan Lake and Sketchley, were key figures in the nationalist politics of the 1950s and 1960s. Often participation in church councils and synods provided opportunities for African initiative and responsibility in ways which were denied in racially exclusive colonial structures. This was true for both clergy and laity. For in most Protestant churches, the standards of clerical training at theological colleges fell sadly behind those of the mission high schools, which produced the clerks and teachers, the lawyers and politicians of late colonial society. The disparity between a rather poorly educated clergy geared towards village life and an educated laity in varying degrees orientated towards an urban culture became one of the critical points for the mainline Protestant churches as Africa entered the era of independence, especially as the Africanization of ecclesiastical hierarchies began to take place rapidly in the 1950s, usually just slightly in advance of the political changes which began to sweep across the continent. Max Warren, the immensely creative and perceptive General Secretary of the Church Missionary Society from 1942 to 1963, was particularly important in interpreting to British government and society the anti-colonial movement of the post-war world, particularly in Africa. John V. Taylor, a CMS missionary in Uganda in the 1940s and 1950s, was equally important within Africa in helping the missionary movement and the African church to adjust to the great sea change in society in these years. The Catholic Church had meantime been quietly rectifying its disadvantages vis-a-vis Protestant missions. In addition to catching up educationally, Catholic missionaries were much more visible than their Protestant counterparts at the village level. There was not the same desperate shortage of personnel and the consequent withdrawal upwards into largely institutional life. Catholic catechists had the basic vernacular religious education, which characterized Protestant lay catechists and clergy. In contrast to the large number of African Protestant ministers, there were few African Catholic priests, but they did have the advantage of a long and rigorous seminary education, especially in areas such as Buganda and Igboland, where Catholicism had become deeply rooted and where priestly vocations could be fostered, this opened up the possibility of an Africanization of diocesan clergy and the episcopate, even ahead of Protestant churches. In 1939, Masaka, Uganda, became the first Catholic diocese in Africa entirely to be staffed by African clergy, with an African bishop, Joseph Kiwanuka. It was to take the Anglican Church in Uganda another 8 years before it consecrated its first bishop, Balya, and he was only an assistant. It was to be nearly 100 years after the consecration of Crowther before the Anglicans got round to appointing a second African diocesan bishop. These strengths of African Catholicism were enormously reinforced and reinvigorated by the Second Vatican Council. Probably in no other continent did the Vatican Council coincide quite so neatly and sympathetically with a major process of secular change in Africa. The conciliar themes of localization and pluralism, of the recognition of the positive values of different cultures and even other religious traditions, the new use of the vernacular in the liturgy, ecumenical rapprochement, all this conformed with the general early 1960s stress on African political and cultural values, on decolonialization, on the social necessity of cooperation and unity across the divisions of tribe, race, and religion. On both sides, there was the sense of a fresh, rather optimistic new start, and the two were easily allied. Along with this went the rapid Africanization of national hierarchies, an often radical and thoroughgoing inculturation of the liturgy, a vigorous evangelization program into areas previously hardly affected by Catholicism or any form of Christian expression, a blossoming of Catholic participation in national life that would have seemed difficult to imagine outside the Portuguese and Belgian territories in colonial times, and which has provided the basis for the high profile of Catholicism in independent Africa. Christianity and the politics of independent Africa. The rapid decolonization process, which took place quite suddenly in the late 1950s and 1960s, effectually handed over government in many parts of Africa to the mission-educated elite. In mobilizing popular support for independence and nation-building in the early years of independence, it was often useful to speak critically of mission Christianity, of the ideological support which mission education gave to colonialism. Nkrumah expressed a widespread irritation with what appeared to be an over-spiritualizing interpretation of mission religion in his much-quoted dictum, "Seek ye first the political kingdom." Pan-Africanism in the 1960s might seem to be an appropriate alternative both to colonialism and to certain aspects of mission Christianity. But there were also powerful currents which served to reinforce Christianity in the new nation states. Most politicians continued to have links with their churches. If the mission-founded churches had often underpinned the colonial state, their establishment mentality also meant that they were potentially just as useful to rulers in independent states. Independent churches, AICs, seemed less amenable to this kind of co-option. Insofar as they had a political profile, they were often regarded with considerable suspicion by governments. If they were not political, they could be easily ignored or regarded with benign condescension. There was a strong element of religious idealism in the programs of many first-generation leaders. Nyerere's Catholicism was an important element in his African socialism program for Tanzania. Kuanda's Presbyterian upbringing shaped his African humanism, which did not have the anti-religious streak of the European variety, in Zambia. Independents put no brake on people seeking baptism. Indeed, in their strong urge to extend and broaden the school system, even if they wanted to take the school out of denominational control, governments gave an added incentive for people to seek church affiliation, especially in the mission-founded churches, traditionally strong in the educational field. In the decades after independence, as African states passed through various social, political, and economic crises, resulting in army rule or an increasing breakdown of law and order, the church often proved remarkably resilient, both in an institutional sense and as a moral and spiritual focus of hope, in situations where it did not, in fact, make sense to seek first the political kingdom. In the late 1980s, churches, for example in Malawi or Benin, might be at the center of movements towards democratization, as old authoritarian regimes began to crumble. Nowhere was this more the case than in South Africa. Individuals such as Michael Scott or Trevor Huddleston or Cosmos Desmond had achieved a worldwide fame in the 1950s and 1960s for their personal opposition, taking advantage of the leverage they had as white non-nationals. By the 1980s, this had become a more general and broadly based opposition, in which the churches were seen to represent society as a whole. The role of Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Alan Boesak was significant for the work of the UDF, United Democratic Front, which, in the absence of normal politics and the continued banning of the African National Congress and other political movements, served as a force to mobilize and fatally to undermine the apartheid regime. In these situations of apparent social disintegration, the churches were often able to recruit into their ministry people of high educational attainment, who in previous generations might well have looked for jobs in the civil service or the law or journalism or indeed in politics. The churches themselves became, for the first time, providers of university-level education, often in seminaries designed for ministerial training. At the local level where the churches had such strength, the bishop or church leader might be looked to in order to provide political and material goods which the state was no longer able to supply, either because good government no longer existed in corrupt and authoritarian regimes, or because the structural readjustment programs imposed from outside the 1980s had a strong bias against government as the chief provider of welfare and services. On the other hand, as the democratization movement did begin to have some success and to make its impact on the governmental processes of many countries, so the fact that the churches themselves had themselves become deeply entangled in webs of corruption become obvious. The claims of the churches to offer a moral lead for society had become problematic and needed to be treated with caution. Nevertheless, there has been brave witness from church people in the face of tyranny or barbarism. In 1977, the centenary year of Christianity in Uganda, Anglican Archbishop Janani Luwum died a brutal death at the hands of Idi Amin, reminding the church during that critical time that it was founded on the witness of the martyrs. Luwum represented the best of the revival, Balakole tradition. In the ethnic conflicts in Rwanda between 1959 and 1961, which heralded independence, there were also martyrs from the revival movement, as there had been in Kenya in the Mau Mau period. In a biographical survey of 200 African priests who have died violent deaths over the last 40 years, 9 are listed for Uganda, including Fr. Clement Kigundu, the editor of the Catholic newspaper Muno, Ananias Oriang from Lengo, Gabriel Banduga from Ara, and Charles Oberu from Tokoro. But this number, depressing though it is, pales into insignificance beside the 31 listed for Burundi and the appalling 103 for Rwanda, half the total for the whole of Africa, and chiefly relating to the genocide of 1994. What about the countless laymen and women who have been victims, and under what circumstances is one classed as a witness for truth? Clergy have also been accused of condoning and even participating in genocide, and indeed, in as Christian a country as Rwanda, the vast majority of the perpetrators of crimes of genocide must have been baptized and have had some kind of Christian upbringing. The Church's witness in Africa, in common with all places and times, is rarely unambiguous. If ethnicity, with all the problems of definition which this concept has, is often seen as an important element in much conflict at the end of the 20th century, religion is also a factor, often expressed in Islamic-Christian conflict. In sub-Saharan Africa, Islam and Christianity have usually existed side by side, with the minority faith having a secure niche and a valued place in the society. Conflict in the last part of the 20th century has been focused on the Sahelian belt of countries like Sudan and Nigeria, with a strong traditional Muslim majority in the north and a more recent and increasing Christian presence in the south. In the case of many West African countries, there was an active policy of Christian evangelization among people who have been influenced by Islam for many centuries without becoming fully part of the house of Islam. Political conflict often hardens ethnic and religious definition, where fluidity and tolerance existed before. African theology. Even before the process of colonization properly got underway, in terms of practical politics, there were intellectual movements intent on reclaiming the African heritage. A renewed interest in the springs of an African philosophy, a re-evaluation of the spiritual value of African religious consciousness, was particularly notable among African Francophone intellectuals from the 1930s. Senghor, in collaboration with others from the African diaspora living in Paris, were exploring concepts like negritude, and after the Second World War, Léon Diop's review Présence africaine provided a stimulating forum for a French-speaking African intelligentsia. In a specifically Catholic environment, the work of Placide Tempels on Bantu philosophy, published in French in 1945, inspired a generation of Francophone Catholic scholars such as the Rwandan Tutsi Alexis Kagame and the Colony's Vincent Mulago. A group of students studying in Rome in the 1950s, including Kagame and Mulago, produced the famous collection of essays, Des Prêtres Noirs et Intelligents. Are we African priests going to defend our hidden complex of being poor relatives in the Church of God forever? Or will we be sowers of Christian enthusiasm, which will force each one of us to rethink this problem of African fundamental theology? These intellectual stirrings were underway before the Second Vatican Council. For the African Catholic Church, the reforms of the 1960s fell on ground well prepared. There was to be a great flowering of Catholic theology concerned with enculturating the gospel in Africa and giving theological depth and resonance to the transformation of worship through the introduction of vernacular liturgies and music. These transformations were often enthusiastically pushed through by expatriate missionaries in a church which still depended heavily on clerical support from outside the continent. But especially in the area of pastoral theology, it was increasingly the large number of African priests coming out of the major seminaries who were setting the agenda. A milestone of Protestant thinking was the work of the Ghanaian Presbyterian layman, a lawyer and politician, J.B. Danquah. In the Akan Doctrine of God, 1944, Danquah attempted in a detailed and rigorous way to present African traditional religion as basically monotheistic and therefore basically compatible with the Christian view of God. This was the first of a long line of West African theologians, both lay and clerical. Bolaji Adowu, Harry Sawyer, C.G. Baeta, Kwesi Dixon, to name just a few of the first generation who laid the foundations of an African theology for the Protestant churches. In East Africa, John Mbiti has had a seminal influence on ordinands since the 1960s, not to mention the religious education syllabuses of secondary schools. If there is a Protestant equivalent to Tempels as progenitor of an African theology, that accolade must surely go to Edwin Smith, the primitive Methodist missionary who articulated a synthesis of African views of God and shaped it as a coherent, unified, rather too unified perhaps, theology. Mbiti's African Religions and Philosophy continued that work. The tendency to see traditional African society as saturated with religion and to perceive African religion as basically consonant with Christianity has been criticized by people like Okat Bitek, the Ugandan poet and thinker. For Okat, the African worldview has a much more radically secular orientation. Christian theology in South Africa stood rather apart from these developments. The struggle against apartheid needed a protesting theology of crisis rather than an affirming theology of enculturation. The emphasis on tradition could also be interpreted in the South African context as repressive, reinforcing separate development, tribal homelands, and the narrowness of Bantu education. South African theologians increasingly adopted a political protest theology with a certain kinship to North American Black theology. This was expressed among Black students through the Black consciousness movement promoted in the early 1970s by the medical student Steve Biko. Even at this late state, one notes the appalling irrelevance of the interpretation given to all scriptures. In a country teeming with injustice and fanatically committed to the practice of oppression, intolerance, and blatant cruelty because of racial bigotry, the church further adds to their insecurity by its inward-directed definition of the concept of sin and its encouragement of the mea culpa attitude. Black theology, therefore, is a situational interpretation of Christianity. It seeks to relate the present-day Black man to God within the given context of the Black man's suffering and his attempt to get out of it. Biko, murdered by the police in 1977, remained a powerful symbol to many young people, both those who wanted to explore the liberating role of Christianity and those who felt that one should abandon a church which seemed irrelevant to the struggle. In 1985, a group of Black and white South African theologians produced an important document concerning the political situation. They called it the Kairos document. Kairos refers to the Greek word used in the New Testament to indicate a time of decision, of momentous significance for the individual or community involved. The document combined something of the burning indignation of a man like Biko with the white involvement in protest, which had often looked for inspiration to the model of the confessing church in Germany in its struggle against Hitler. The document urged the churches to get beyond a state theology which justified Afrikaner nationalism or a church theology preoccupied with its own affairs in a supposed apartheid-free zone to a prophetic theology, which was willing to challenge the foundations of an unjust state. Conclusion. Christianity in contemporary Africa is an immensely varied and complex phenomenon. It also remains an immensely powerful force, deeply rooted in rural society. Catholicism, which in the early part of the 20th century was particularly assiduous in cultivating a village Christianity, and as a result managed numerically to catch up and overtake the Protestant churches in area after area, has in the last 30 years or so also put great efforts into maintaining and expanding its educational structures. At the time of independence, there was an understandable emphasis on developing national educational systems and loosening the bonds of mission or church control. The Catholic Church has been more alert and attentive to the need to keep a foothold in the educational sphere, exploiting whatever residual powers it retained and continuing to support its former schools in terms of finances and personnel. Governments have become more anxious to involve churches again in the running of educational system, which by the 1990s had become a seemingly intolerable burden on national resources due to expanding youthful populations and insatiable demand for educational provision. The Catholic Church has often been able to respond more effectively than most other institutions. By the 1990s, private universities were springing up in many countries, and here it was often evangelical bodies with American money and resources who have grasped the opportunities presented. The old distinction between mission-founded mainline churches and the African-instituted churches may appear to have lost much of its rationale, as all churches are now African-led, and there are few which would reject some form of enculturation. On the other hand, there are still suspicions between the two traditions. There is an unwillingness among many Christians from the mission-founded church fully to accept independent churches as properly Christian, accusing them of being unorthodox doctrinally, of incorporating unacceptable practices into their worship and lifestyle. African-instituted churches naturally resent the often supercilious attitude of the mission-founded churches, whom they accuse of failing to address the spiritual realities of African life, or to meet the range of needs of ordinary people. This in turn creates a false dichotomy between areas which Christian practice can deal with and those where one should consult traditional diviners and religious practitioners. The last decades of the 20th century saw an explosion of new Pentecostal churches. At one level, this is an example of the Americanization of culture on a worldwide basis, a re-alienation of the African church under the influence of the strident and uncompromising tenets of the American religious right. American evangelical money and personnel, para-church evangelistic ministries, cheap and available literature, an emphasis on personal salvation, healing, deliverance from demons, the gospel of prosperity, offering material blessings to believers, charismatic worship in a technologically sophisticated modern idiom. These are some of the constituents of this new wave of Christianity. It can result in a narrowing of perspective and a failure to engage fruitfully with either political or social realities. Nevertheless, it does address African needs in ways which some of the traditional forms of Christianity are manifestly failing to do. The appeal is to urban youth, both the successful for whom it justifies the accumulation of wealth, and the less successful, semi and unemployed, for whom it opens up new horizons of hope and offers tantalizing possibilities. The Pentecostal movement tends to be even more condemnatory of compromise with paganism than the old established churches, and consequently more hostile to those African-instituted churches which are arrogantly dismissed as pagan. On the other hand, the Pentecostal movement does focus on, rather than shy away from, the realm of spiritual powers, and so, like the older independent churches, can be seen as dealing with this important area of life in more honest and direct ways, helping people to cope with the struggle which defines and circumscribes day-to-day life for so many. The Pentecostal style of worship is more in tune with youth culture. The village Christianities, which dominated African Christianity for much of the 20th century, are now giving way to a more urban-oriented style of life and worship. Many people, in fact, retain a double identity, worshiping in the Pentecostal church in town, but using their inherited church tradition for some of the important rites of passage. Also, the older churches, especially in towns, are introducing charismatic styles of worship and attitudes to modern living, which sometimes upset the older members. Christianity, as has been the case for much of its modern history in Africa, is youth-driven in a way which is almost unimaginable in Europe. American evangelists may come and go. Increasingly, these types of churches are African-led and are expressing African solution to African problems. If the burgeoning urban centers are setting trends, this is not the only important development in Africa. There continue to be areas of primary evangelism. One example is in the Dinka and Nuer areas of southern Sudan, which have seen war, the disruption of the cattle culture central to existence, a renewal of slave trading, and what are resented as attempts to introduce an alien, in this case Arab and Muslim, culture from the north. The area has a long history of fairly superficial encounter with Catholic and Protestant mission. In a society which is being torn apart, Christianity is seen as a new force, a new spiritual power. These contemporary examples give some indication of the enormous variety of forms which African Christianity takes at the end of the 20th century. It also illustrates the often critical situation in which Africa exists. Whatever the solutions to these problems, if there are solutions, Christianity is bound to have a deep concern. Christianity and Islam are the dominating religions, each claiming the allegiance of about half the population, and now deeply enmeshed in the structures of African society, politics, and culture. The traditional African spiritual heritage remains very much alive, expressed as much within Christianity and Islam as outside these religions. It seems likely that, at some point in the 21st century, Christians in Africa will become more numerous than Christians in any other single continent, and more important than ever before in articulating a global Christian identity in a pluralist world. This ends chapter 6.